Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. Hope is the first step on the road to disappointment. This and many other Imperial catechisms certainly ring true when it comes to Warhammer 40,000 games. As a fairly enthusiastic consumer of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, I do tend to play pretty much every 40k game that comes out. And lately, that has resulted in more disappointment than it has joy on my part. That's not all that surprising. You might be aware that Games Workshop, once very litigious and quite careful with its license and its intellectual property, decided to throw open the gates a couple of years ago to pretty much any company that wanted to create video games with their Warhammer properties. This has resulted in a large number of new Warhammer titles, most of them based in the 40,000 universe, for the fairly obvious reason that the 40,000 universe is the most popular of the franchises that is currently being operated by Games Workshop, particularly since the whole Age of Sigmar thing came around and, they blew up the entire Warhammer world in End Times and all that stuff in the fantasy universe that not a lot of people have really been paying attention to. Now, unfortunately, while we've actually had a couple of pretty good fantasy-based games, Vermintide is excellent. I'd say it's on the level of Left 4 Dead, in some respects even better, especially when it comes to the combat system, although weaker in others, particularly when it comes to performance and the occasional bug. And we also had Mordheim, which is quite an interesting little turn-based tactics game that is quite fun to play. Of course, you could even bear in mind something like Blood Bowl 2, if you like. On the 40,000 front, not so much. Last year, we had the rather excellent Battlefleet Gothic, which is an offshoot of Warhammer 40,000. It was originally a tabletop game of fleet combat in the 41st millennium. It was great. One of my top games of the year. Enjoyed it a lot. But outside of that, we had some pretty disappointing entries for the franchise, particularly Eternal Crusade, which had originally launched with the idea of being a fully fledged 40,000 MMO, which a lot of people really liked the idea of. Of course, it never really came to pass. The studio behind it, Behavior, was by no means known for its excellent titles. In fact, I think they may have been responsible for the B-movie game. And for that, they will never be forgiven, scourged as heretics. But we've had a lot of mobile ports for Warhammer 40,000 games. And general slapdash products. I'm going to demonstrate a couple of those today, because in the last couple of weeks we have received not one but two Warhammer 40,000 games, both turn-based strategy titles, which you would think would be relatively easy to implement, bearing in mind that the tabletop Warhammer 40,000 game is, for all intents and purposes, a turn-based wargame. That's the easiest way to translate the franchise, yes? Well, apparently not. If these games are anything to go by, it's actually a lot trickier than it looks. So we'll start with the Horus Heresy Battle of Tallarn, which is a turn-based, hex-based strategy game, for the most part based on mechanized combat. There's a few infantry units here and there, but they don't tend to live very long in the poison atmosphere of Tallarn. This is based in the Horus Heresy era, which has started to be explored a little bit more in video games. We got the fairly terrible Horus Heresy Talisman board game last year, I believe, or either that or the year before. That wasn't particularly good, not a great use of the license. And there's also a mobile game available, which is a Clash of Clans clone based in the Horus Heresy, which, for being a Clash of Clans clone, actually is not that bad. It could be a hell of a lot worse. We didn't get that on PC, mercifully, but we did get this. This is out on mobile devices as well, and honestly, you can tell, because there are some interface issues with it, although that's the least of the problems that this game has. This video will feature two of these wonderfully mediocre 40,000 titles, so we'll start by having a look at this one. There are things missing, let's just put it that way. I never like seeing things like this. It's like, oh, great. Those are my graphics options. HD and SD, these are not relevant terms when dealing with the PC. It already looks really old, doesn't it? I was actually talking about UI design in 90s games during the Co-optional podcast, and I noted that a lot of those games went for form over function. They went all in on the idea of a thematic UI. Very old school way of designing UI, and generally inconvenient and obnoxious. This game suffers from that as well. You've got these ridiculous light-up buttons and things like that. It's a minor little complaint. It's hardly game-breaking, but it's indicative perhaps of backwards thinking, and in particular with this game, it does both look and feel like a very old title, something that hasn't really learned any lessons from the last 10 or so years of turn-based games, which have advanced an awful lot and are having something of a resurgence of popularity as of late. Mouse and trackpad options. So you can tell this was maybe designed for mobile and things like that. You do at least have some hotkeys, and you can even rebind them, which is lovely. It does take about 41 millennia to scroll down here, or in the case of the Horus Heresy, I suppose that'll be 31 millennia. Yeah, better get that right. A lot of the menus are a little bit like this. They don't scroll very well. But these are minor little complaints. You know, when I see things like that, they're usually indicative that there are probably much larger problems lurking beneath the waves, as it were. They're just the tip of the iceberg. And with this game in particular, that is very true. If we head to new game, I've played a bunch of the different missions, and I've played some of the campaign missions as well. And there is some interesting stuff going on when it comes to the mission design, let me put it that way. I started by playing the Traitor Legions, because hey, that's fun, right? I want to play the bad guys, the Iron Warriors in this case. So I thought, hey, I'll play the first mission of the Apocalypse campaign as Traitor, and repeatedly got slapped about. And I'm not inexperienced when it comes to hex-based or turn-based tactics or strategy. So I thought, what am I doing wrong here? So what I did was I switched over to the Loyalists and immediately steamrolled the mission. And what I realized is that they didn't properly balance the traitor version of the mission versus the loyalist version. The loyalist version of this mission is incredibly easy. You can completely overwhelm the enemy. Easily. Your tanks are more than enough to beat them, and you also vastly outnumber them and have a reinforcement mechanic, where if you are holding reinforcement points on the map, you just get extra tanks, whereas the traitors don't. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to jump in here. So I'm going to play as the traitors. This is mission 1, bear that in mind. Only the first mission. You'd think this would be a relatively easy start for 10. You start with 3 Predator Destructors, and you get to choose support units here. These Destructors apparently stick with you throughout the campaign, and if you get additional units, they'll stick around, but on various difficulty levels, if they get destroyed, it'll take a while for them to be replaced. Depends on what difficulty you're playing on as to how true that is. But you can also pick support units, and these are customized on a mission-by-mission basis. So I could have 3 more Destructors, 3 Executioners. Will it tell you what these do? No. No, of course not. I mean, hell, I know a decent amount about 40k lore, and I'll be damned if I can necessarily remember the differences between Predator variants. And if you don't know a lot about that, you'll be fresh out of luck. You won't know what any of these do. Why is it that you can't just click here and get some information? What does a Contemptor Dreadnought Keras variant do? I have no idea. So you can't even make a good decision here. It's mostly pot luck. I discovered that the best selection seems to be the 3 Predator Executioners and the extra Contemptor Dreadnought, from what I can tell. I should also point out, by the way, that despite the fact it says that these are the only units you actually get more than this, which is weird, unless somehow this counts as a squad of Dreadnoughts, which I suppose is possible, but again, it's not particularly clear about anything. So we'll jump in as standard, and the mission is quite simple. Take 2 objectives and hold them. Alternatively, destroy the whole Imperial army, which sounds easy enough, right? No, not really. So here we are. We have arrived. These are the objectives. Hold 2 objectives by the end of turn 8, 3 by the end of turn 16, or destroy the enemy army, but don't lose 50% of yours. But bear in mind, losing 50% of this army is actually really easy. That's not that many units. We're sitting on what? 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 tanks and 3 dreadnoughts. Why I have 3 dreadnoughts when it said that I was going to get 1, I have no idea. That's very, very odd. At least I have my 3 Predator Executioners over here that I said I would have. It's very strange that it gives you extra units. It doesn't even list the full amount of units that you're given here. So it's a very standard hex-based war game. Each of these tanks can move and fire, or they can move at flank speed, which will not allow them to shoot. These blips on the radar indicate that there are enemy units there, but they're currently within the fog of war. I can't hit them, I can't see them. Line of sight is relatively important. So, to start with, I'd probably want to creep forward just a little bit. This red area right here demonstrates what I can shoot out with my turret-based weapons, and the weapons on the tank are listed down the bottom here. Now, annoyingly, you are not given specific stats as to what these weapons actually do. You're just given these blocks and little inaccurate bar graphs. I don't like that. When it comes to tactics games, I think you have to be as transparent as possible with the information that you're giving the player, because only then will they be able to make good decisions. So when you list weapons with these inaccurate little graphs, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. What does rate of fire even mean in this situation? Does that mean I get to shoot less than once per turn? I mean, it's under 1, right? But that's, as far as I'm aware, that's not true. So I don't even know what these stats mean. Obviously, you know, armor piercing, great, that's useful. But what does, I mean, that seems to be slightly less than 2 AP. What does 2 AP mean? I don't know. Game never tells you any of that stuff. It gives you a vague description of the concepts. If you head over to help and go to how to play, you will get some basic idea of how some of this stuff works. But it doesn't even go into detail on any of them. That's the main problem with it. You can also go to charts and you can see weapon effects and all that sort of thing. These are pieces of information that should be available simply with hover over tooltips, but they're not. They're in this giant list, which again takes 31 millennia to scroll down. You have to grab a hold of it if you want to do it. So you've got to remember what all of these damn things do. Thankfully, I remember what some of them do from the tabletop game. Yeah, I know that twin linked increases the chance of hitting the target because you're firing 2 weapons at once at the same thing, so all that kind of thing. I get that, but why exactly can't I just hover over? If you see blast right here, hovering over this and telling me what blast did would be really helpful. It doesn't, though. As I said, obscuring information, never a good thing. Do not obfuscate information in your tactics games. Don't do it. Alright. We've moved our tanks, end of the turn. And in come the Imperial tanks, a never-ending frickin' wave of them. The stuff at the front is relatively weak. These little Centaur utility tanks, they die pretty easily. But behind them, Leman Russ Vanquishers, and plenty of them, in fact. Which actually are pretty damn tough compared to my Predator Destructors right here. So, we'll take aim, right-click. It gives you a probable outcome. That's what it tells you. It sometimes gives you a percentage to do damage. It says the probable outcome here is that I will destroy the target. And it went down. Good. But, of course, there are plenty of opportunities for that not to happen. And that is frequently the case. There's a lot of dice rolling going on under the hood here. Far, far too much. This little battle log right here doesn't have anywhere near enough information. I think if you're going to do a game that has a ton of dice rolling, again, you've got to be very transparent with it, because otherwise players will feel like the game is screwing them over unfairly. When you hide that sort of information, you increase the likelihood that a player is going to believe that, and frankly, they're justified in believing those sort of things. Alright, we're going to increase that tank to maximum speed and move our Dreadnought over there as well. I want to try and take that objective, because if the Imperials take it, they're going to get endless reinforcements. They already outnumber me, with great tanks, by the way. But it's going to get even worse in a minute. Alright, in come the tanks, who all have good range on me, but I can't see them for whatever reason, despite the fact we're sitting on the same terrain. Alright, so here's where things get really, really weird when it comes to the balance. I was talking about the difference in the balance with this mission. This mission is identical, depending on... It doesn't matter which side you play. If you play the Imperial side, you get all of these tanks that the AI has. If you play the Traitor side, you get these. Significantly less, and no reinforcements either. The thing is that the game is not properly balanced around that idea. Usually, if you were to play 2 sides of the same mission, the chances are they would rebalance each side to make sure that each side was a reasonable challenge. In this case, though, the Imperials have a much easier time, whereas the Traitors have an incredibly difficult time beating this mission. And here's one of the reasons for that. You'll notice that there's a little shield down here on this Leman Russ Vanquisher. That's indicating that my main gun does not do enough damage to penetrate its front armor. It is literally invulnerable to all of the weapons that my main battle tank has. The only way I can do damage with it using this tank is to get to the side of it or get to the back of it. And you might think, all right, well, that makes perfect sense. It's a tactics game, of course. Of course you should maneuver around. Yes, but the problem is it doesn't apply the other way around. The front armor on these things is slightly better than the Predator, which means that the Vanquisher's cannon can do damage to the front armor of the Predator, whereas the Predator can't do damage to the front armor of the Leman Russ Vanquisher. Guess what that ends up resulting in? Yeah, I think you can probably guess. The mission is horribly imbalanced in favor of the Imperials, which is nonsense. It makes this mission extremely difficult to beat as the traitor side. And that is just an incredible sin to me. I don't see how this mission could have possibly got through playtesting. When I played it on the Imperial side, I absolutely demolished it. Easily, within like 3 minutes, no problem, I just ran over them. I didn't have to think about what I was doing because I vastly outnumbered the enemy and just blew them up with sheer weight of shots. And as I said, the Predators, the main Predator battle tanks you have here, can't penetrate the front armor of a Leman Russ anyway, so I could just sit there with a line of tanks, bear in mind this is very open terrain, and just fire at them. The only unit I have that can do damage to the front armor of this tank is a Dreadnought, and I don't have many of those, as you can probably see. 28% chance to damage it. And there you go, I was able to take away 1 pip of the HP. Everything else, though, nope! I mean, for God's sake, even these Predator Executioners that have Plasma Destroyers, you think that sounds like a good AP weapon, right? It's actually not, they're more of a blast weapon. But I would have to get to the side of these tanks or to the back to do damage. I can hurt these guys, but as I said, it's just incredibly badly conceived, and it's not the only mission that's like this. I found that a lot of the traitor missions are very, very badly balanced. You see, I was able to do some damage there. It's a little ridiculous, by the way. If you're a Warhammer 40,000 fan, you might be saying, hang on a minute, doesn't the Predator Executioner have twin-link las cannon on the side of it? Why can't it penetrate the armor of a Vanquisher from the front? Good point! I would love to know. For those who don't know, in 40k, a las cannon is one of the most powerful armor-piercing weapons in the game. At least it was when I played it. Maybe that's changed since then, I somehow doubt it. You should be able to do damage from the front. They're deliberately designed to melt armor like that. The fact that I can't is a very strange amount of balance. I mean, obviously you have to tweak the numbers between a tabletop board game, a war game, and a video game. I get that, absolutely, but it's pretty ridiculous that those armor-piercing weapons somehow can't hurt these guys. As I said, you've got to attack them from the side, which is tricky. You know, they outnumber you, and they can do a decent amount of damage to your front as well. I don't know. That's just one example of quite a few pretty horribly balanced missions in this game. Now, the main sin that this game has, frankly, is just being a fairly dull tactics game. It's about as run-of-the-mill as you can possibly get. You move, you shoot. You move, you shoot. You don't really have many special actions. If you get to play one of the super heavies, like a Baneblade tank or one of the Titans, for instance, you get to shoot twice, if you so desire, with different weapons. That's about as much variety as you get. Otherwise, it is move and shoot, move and shoot, move and shoot. And it is tiresome. It definitely feels like this game was using the existing systems of previous Hex War tactics games and just slapping a Warhammer 40,000 coat of paint on top of it. And selling games on theme is not necessarily the worst thing ever. It happens all the time in board gaming, and I'll happily do that. I'll happily buy a re-themed board game if it happens to be a theme I genuinely enjoy. But with video games, I think maybe it's not as commonly accepted. And honestly, in this case, whatever their base was for this obviously wasn't all that entertaining in the first place. It looks elderly. It's not particularly impressive. A lot of grays and browns. The animation is almost non-existent. Despite that, during some of the animations, like, say, moving, it actually causes the frame rate to drop. I don't really know why that is. It's not particularly stable. Not really sure what's going on with that. It just ends up being bland and dry. The sound assets are particularly poor as well. The music is horribly repetitive. not something that I would really choose to listen to at any point. And here's the thing about that. If you're relying mostly on theme, then those aesthetic elements are perhaps even more important than they would be in a game that uses original IP. If you're relying on theme, well, those that enjoy that universe are expecting it to be shown and interpreted in an impressive and enjoyable way. And in this case, this looks incredibly basic. I remember playing stuff like Epic Final Liberation back in the 90s, and this game is not much of an advancement on that in terms of the level of detail. And this is 2017, so you would expect certainly a little bit better. And crummy sound assets, poor animations, and all that sort of thing don't really do a particularly good job when it comes to encouraging people to play and immerse themselves in the universe. What you've got is just a very, very run-of-the-mill tactics game that appears to be poorly designed, poorly balanced, and has some annoying little features. Here's a great example of that. Turning the tanks is a pain in the arse, and it's very important because you have to present your best side of armor, and if you want to fire with your front-facing pintle-mounted weaponry, you got to be facing forward. Obviously, turrets can rotate, these can't. So if I want to fire with everything I've got to do that. But look at this. It only works if I put my mouse in the little area here. If I click anywhere else, rotation doesn't work. And considering it's such a key part of the game, you would think that they would not want to make that a pain in the ass. Not in the slightest. You would not. No, that's a terrible idea. But it seems like they did. I don't know why that is. I played it on iOS as well, and I think it was less of a pain in the ass to turn it there. It makes me think that it's a case of being a fairly ill-thought-out mobile port. But if you're looking for Warhammer 40,000 turn-based tactics game, there are already better ones available. Some of them are much, much older. I would say Final Liberation is a much better game than this, even if down to the fact that it actually just has some personality to it. It has FMV cutscenes, Commissar Holt, characters. It actually takes advantage of the universe in a real way. And honestly, in terms of its mechanics, it's no more basic than this. In fact, it may very well be more advanced in places. It's a little bit silly, to say the least, that we have a game coming out at this point that is less advanced than that. And I get it. It's a $10 experience. I'm going to jump out of this mission. I'll show you something with a few more interesting units, at least. It's a budget game. It's a $10 game on PC. I get that, but there are so many very, very good tactics games. They don't necessarily have a Warhammer 40,000 theme, but if you want to play that, hell, you could play Warhammer 40,000 Armageddon that came out relatively recently. And in my opinion, that is a better tactics game than this. Much better. Battle for the Beacons. We could do that. That'll probably give me more interesting forces. Not that it ever tells you or gives you any kind of force customization before you go into the mission. But hey, I've got myself some Valdor tank hunters, some bigger tanks, some Malkadors, and all sorts of things like that. It's a giant freaking army of tanks. Lehman Rush demolishers and all that sort of thing. It would be nice to actually get some real choice here. You do at least get a giant tank battle out of this, but it's a slow, clunky, and relatively unenjoyable one. It's not tactically engaging. I don't believe there's a great deal of strategy involved in it, just because there aren't all that many options. It's about as basic as it gets. And while I do have a degree of tolerance for dice rolling as a former Warhammer 40,000 player, I think that those that play video games expect a little better, and of course more transparency with it. There's nothing worse than having 4 or 5 of your tanks blown up by lucky shots, whereas you unload half a galaxy's worth of ordnance into the enemy and they just resist every single shot. That's annoying, to say the least, and the way that you mitigate that is by being transparent. As I said, it's just so very basic. If you are looking for a basic tactics game and the theme is super important to you, maybe you just really, really like the tanks of the 40,000 universe, I don't blame you. I don't blame you for that at all. I love those, but honestly, this is not a great game. It's painfully mediocre, I think. Maybe you pick it up on mobile devices just because you don't have many better options. But I would suggest that you don't get so obsessed with the theme and just look for a better tactics game in general. It being Warhammer 40,000 only saves it from being utterly without note. And that's a shame. A lot of the 40k games that are coming out right now are exploiting that very fact. They know that there is a rabid fan base looking to consume that media so that they can throw out any old tat. Well, I don't agree. I think you'll find that those fans are perhaps far more discerning than you assume. It's not a good idea to annoy them. So that is Battle for Tallarn. As I said, very, very basic. Now, we're going to move on to another Warhammer 40,000 turn-based tactics game that came out over the last few weeks. Goes by the name of 40k Sanctus Reach. Now here we have Warhammer 40,000 Sanctus Reach. If you haven't heard of the developer Straylight Entertainment, I don't blame you. They don't even have a website. They exist under the publisher Slytherin, who are pretty well known for publishing quite a lot of war games and strategy stuff. It's usually a lot of fairly niche war game titles that are fairly highly priced for what they are, but aimed at something of a niche market. In this case, of course, with Warhammer 40,000, you aren't necessarily aiming at such a small market, but the pricing scheme of these games, i.e. being maybe a little bit higher than they should be for their production values, seems to remain true here. The developer, nowhere to be seen. I have no idea who these guys are. Couldn't find any information about them at all. If we head over to the options menu, it's a little bit more competent than the previous title we looked at. Like, everything's on the same page in a way that makes sense, with resolution next to your graphics options. Not that there are many of those. You have anti-aliasing. I couldn't even tell you what kind of AA this is, because the game doesn't tell you either. And you have to restart the game every time you change one of these things, even if you change shadow quality, for God's sake. I don't know what's going on with that. Now, down here you have an option that was recently added, and I'm kind of glad that they added it, but they went a little bit far with it. Faster movement. One of the main problems I had with the initial release of this game is that the animations took way too damn long to go through, and as a result, you'd be sitting around waiting for things to finish. They took that feedback and said, hey, okay, we'll put in a faster movement mode. By faster movement, they meant 10 times as fast. Literally 10 times the normal speed, which looks quite silly, and as you'll probably notice, breaks some of the animations. What it doesn't do is increase the speed of attack animations, which was actually what was taking up most of the time. So they didn't really fix an awful lot there. We're going to dive in here, and I'll show you what's going on with this. Load up one of our auto saves, perhaps, or one of our older ones. This was, I believe, part of the campaign, so we can jump into that and see what's going on with it. And I'll show you a skirmish mission as well, give you an idea of what to expect here. Now, it is another turn-based strategy or tactics game, however you prefer to refer to it. I believe I'm coming towards the end of this mission here. And what you'll probably notice is, again, a very basic-looking game, a very elderly-looking title, but it certainly is not merely archaic in terms of its graphical assets. It's also pretty elderly when it comes to things like its animations. I'll demonstrate by zooming in here and show you what's going on. Let's just say a lack of detail in that regard. The melee animations look far, far worse than the shooting. Unfortunately, I can't use my chainswords here because I'm sort of towards the end of the turn, but you'll get to see it sooner rather than later, trust me. We're just taking over this communications array right here. I just want to move my pack leader over here. That's how the movement works with faster movement on, by the way. Yeah, it's a little silly, to say the least. But if you actually turn that off, then you'll see exactly why it was that people wanted that option in the first place. You just get over there. It can take a while. It can definitely eat up a little bit of time. But as I said, it's the attack animations that eat up more time than that, which is why it's a little surprising that they haven't really done anything about that. Now, you can attack twice every turn, so you're stuck with watching quite a lot of attack and damage animations, and you can't really do anything until each animation has concluded, which means that moving is a little dull, to say the least. It tests the patience. Outside of that, what you have, again, is another very, very basic turn-based tactics game. In this case, however, they do use something of an action point system, And they've got a couple of nice ideas, like the ability to set up reaction fire. So each unit usually has one, sometimes more reactions, and you can set an arc of reaction by clicking here and saying, I want you to aim here. It's basically a free Overwatch, and anything that moves into your reaction field of fire will get shot at. Pretty key mechanic. And in this case, you have a hell of a lot more information at your disposal. You'll see all of these stats available here, which is great. And things like chance to hit and all sorts of things like that. And it's even got granulated damage per shot, which is a little better, I think, than just applying all the damage at once. It does take a little bit longer, but it gives you a better idea and better player feedback of the kind of damage that your weapon is doing. It's even arguably a little bit more visually satisfying as well. It reminds me of much, much older turn-based games of yore. Games from the 90s, honestly, with that older action point-based system, your basic run-of-the-mill kind of grid, and all that sort of thing. And that's not necessarily bad. I don't think that you could argue that that's bad design. It's old design, certainly. If you were to compare it to something more streamlined, like XCOM 2, for instance, you'd probably say, wow, you know, this is a elderly way of doing things, certainly. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. In terms of its presentation, on the other hand, now that's the main issue that I've got with it. It looks cheap. Far, far cheaper than the price tag would indicate, honestly. You've got very poor animation quality. Your models are basic, to say the least. They're not bad, but they lack detail. And things like the particle effects... I mean, that's also not what melter guns would ever look like, but hey. Things like the particle effects and animations, and I did promise that I'd show you melee. Yeah, this is where things get to look really, really janky. Ugh, just... very stiff. And as I said before, in the assessment of the previous game, if you are going to create a title that is very reliant on theme, you need to nail these aesthetic elements, because that is what the fans of that particular universe expect. They want good presentation. They don't want something that looks like it's 20 years out of date, which is how I would describe this game, both in terms of its mechanics and in terms of its presentation overall. It's by no means as bad as Battle of Tallarn, but it is also, of course, 3 times more expensive, so you'd certainly expect a little bit more out of it. But in many ways, it is just your run-of-the-mill, turn-based tactics game. It's really not got an awful lot going on with it. It doesn't innovate in any particular way. It treads much of the same ground as so many titles over the past 20 years in this particular genre. Which always makes you think, well, why don't I play some of the older 40k games? And honestly, you might be better off, really. It's not awful, but it suffers the curse of mediocrity, which is what an awful lot of these licensed 40k games have been dealing with lately. I recall playing Deathwatch a while ago, which was another tactics game in this universe, and that was Tyranids versus Space Marines, and coming to the same kind of conclusion. It's like, wow, this is just a really basic tactics game with a 40k theme plastered all over it, and that's really about it. Thankfully, there's at least a reasonable campaign here that's tied together with this interesting overmap, and you can select different missions and, of course, acquire different units from time to time. And there's a fairly well fleshed out skirmish mode that has a random map generator. There's a map editor available in it as well. And you've got a reasonable amount of choice as to which forces you bring in. So that's a little bit more fleshed out than something like Tallarn would. You know, here's a great example of that. I have a number of points that I can spend to bring in certain elements of my army. I don't get all of this. If I want to bring in a Predator, I could bring in a Predator. If I want to bring in experienced Wolfguard Terminator unit, I could totally do that. It's a better way to do things. I think that if you're dealing with Warhammer 40,000 in particular, especially those that are used to building their armies on the tabletop, an element of army building is a smart thing to include. And the game does have multiplayer, although you will be struggling to find a game, certainly. So nowhere near as bad. It has some worth. It's just a shame that we get such slapdash games in this particular universe at the moment. Games that feel so elderly, games that feel so out of date, so archaic, games that have poor assets and poor production values and questionable choices in the UI. That's a real shame. That sucks. I would love to see a much, much more polished game in this particular universe, and while last year we did get one of those, thankfully. We got Battlefleet Gothic, which felt very polished and extremely faithful to the lore, understanding the lore and using it to its full effect. In a game like this, I feel like this could be anything. This could be a World War II game, for all intents and purposes. It wouldn't matter. It wouldn't make much of a difference overall. It's just a case of what do the units look like. It doesn't take full advantage of the theme, and as a direct result of that, it's pretty hard to recommend a game like this. Unless you are just a die-hard Warhammer 40,000 fan, absolutely desperate for another Warhammer 40,000 game. Personally, I wouldn't waste your time with it. I'm a die-hard Warhammer 40,000 fan, and I wouldn't waste my time with it. But at least they put some effort into it. It just unfortunately feels cheap and underdeveloped with poor production values, and it doesn't do the universe justice, I'm afraid. The sins of mediocrity, ladies and gentlemen. 2 not-so-great Warhammer 40,000 games coming out within the space of a couple of weeks of each other, available now on Steam, if you so desire. If you want a game like this, I personally would play Warhammer 40,000 Armageddon, which again was published by Slytherin, but was, in my opinion, a much superior game to this, or indeed, something a little bit older. Hell, go play Chaos Gate. That's available on GOG, or Final Liberation. They may be from the 90s, but they do everything that these games do, and in some respects, arguably better, with a much better presentation, even bearing in mind the limitations of the time. My name has been TotalBiscuit. Thank you very much for watching. Perhaps you enjoy these games. Well, blessed is the mind too small for doubt. If you like this video, by all means do feel free to click the like button. If not, you will be consigned to the black ships and fed to the Emperor. I'll see you next time.